Welcome to another edition of the Exponential Era Webcast. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce you our guest today, Dr. Rita McGrath. Rita is a professor at Columbia Business School. She is the founder of Valise, and she is the author of the fabulous, outstanding book, Seeing Around Corners.
Oh, wow. I like all your dog ears.
Yeah, so, I have not just read this book, I have studied it. And, we cited you extensively in our own book, The Exponential Era. So welcome to the webcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the book. But before we go there, I thought we could talk a little bit about your new venture, Valise.
Thank you. Yeah, so Valise was founded in response to some frustration that I had and that my clients have, which is they'll come to an event or do a workshop and it's the scales fall from their eyes and this is so exciting and I want to go do this. And then they get back home and it's like, well, what is it? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it a PowerPoint? Is it an app? Like, what do I do? So the purpose for Valise is really to create capability building tools that just make it easier for people to put in practice some of the innovation and strategy work that I've been talking about.
Okay, very good. So do you have a platform that people can access on the cloud, or how does
There's a website, right? It's called valise.com. And we will have a platform people can play around with. We're hoping before the end of the year.
Okay, very good. So congratulations on getting that launched. All right. So, you've done a great job describing inflection points in your book. And for people in our audience that's not familiar with an inflection point, tell us what an inflection point is and why is it so important?
Sure. So the first person that really made strategic inflection points popular was Andy Grove, I think, back in the 90s. And he wrote a fabulous book called Only the Paranoid Survive, which I think is kind of in the spirit of our conversation here. And I really was inspired by him. And the way that I define an inflection point is it's that tipping point when something in your context changes by an order of 10x. Right? It's 10x more expensive, 10x faster, 10x less easy, something about your environment changes. And what's interesting about them, and I think consistent with your work, is they feel at that moment as though they've come out of nowhere. But if you go back in time and look, what you see is the weak signals that something was on the horizon have usually been building up for quite a while. And it's like the old Hemingway line, right? How did you go bankrupt? Well, gradually, and then suddenly.
So, Rita, why is it so difficult for executives and for companies in general to see those early signals? What is it that prevents them from seeing that inflection point that's about to happen?
Yeah, I think part of it is the reality of their own world and their own success. So if you think about it, any business is born at a particular point in time, and some things are possible and some things are not. So as you build on that success, you start to create a reality around it, right? So you develop key performance indicators that reflect it. You have regulatory structures that affect it. You have industry associations that start to feel really real. And so what an inflection point does is it comes at you from somewhere other than that frame of reference. You almost don't have a receptor for taking it in, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you look at a whole category of companies that were traditional retailers who have now been finding themselves in this direct-to-consumer space. That would be a really interesting category of this kind of thing. They sort of went, well, why do we need delivery trucks, right? Why do we need retail outlets at all? Why don't we just ship it to consumers on a subscription basis? To the point where you can buy just about anything on a subscription basis today. So companies like Casper and Glossier and those kind of things. And I'm sure the incumbent, furniture makers or mattress companies didn't really see that coming.
It's interesting, in high tech, we always had Moore's Law, which sort of chased you to the next node, in a way. But you had to start thinking counterintuitively, which, most people see the inflection and then go, oh, we better get going. And the reality is they had better been looking a long way before. So you had mentioned a couple of very interesting things in your book about where you look, and part of that goes back to Andy Grove and looking at where the snow melts, which we love, but also just the fact that it takes a long time to build to be ready to be in position, to sort of like we say, be able to intercept the horizon. You've got to be looking at it. What are some of the key indicators or areas that people overlook? They don't look. I mean, we know the, outside of the box cliches and things like that, but that's not really it. It's more, there are areas that you can look at. We happen to look at patents as an example. We use an AI group to just go in. It's nice to look at 1 million patents in 4 days. It's a lot easier than, and it gives you some insights. But where do you look? Where do you go to get farther back enough to go, well, if A plus B plus C happen, we're going to get a big D?
Yeah, so the kinds of things I look at are changes in customers' willingness, to accept certain workarounds or accept the way things are done right now, where there's a dissatisfaction that they may maybe not be aware of, but where you can kind of see it. That's one. I also look at building up pressure points, and one that I think is very interesting at this current moment in history is the way that our financial system has worked to basically financialize just about everything to the point where it's gotten really brittle. And so we're seeing enough early warnings to me that I think there's going to be some kind of reaction. Now, that could work out well, or it could work out really badly. And at this point, we can't really tell. But we're badly in need of some kind of rebalancing of a lot of the taken for granted rules about capitalism even. So I look for those kinds of things. And then the other thing that I think is really important to look at is not a point solution by itself. You really need a complete ecosystem. And when you see the brilliant inventions that never really made it, and then 10 years later something else comes along and it's fabulous, a lot of time it's because there was some critical piece of the customer experience that hadn't quite been built yet. So a great example of that is the device that was featured in the documentary about General Magic, right? Fabulous idea, right? It was an iPhone 25 years before there was such a thing as an iPhone. But we didn't have bandwidth, we didn't have connectivity, we didn't have apps, we didn't even know how to program the thing. So it was a brilliant concept, the right idea, but just way too early.
And we look at that from a convergence standpoint and trying to figure out what's the timing of that convergence? You've got this, and then all of a sudden the last piece shows up and now you've got what you really need. So that timing becomes critical. So when you're looking at these pressure points, and I really like the capitalism piece because I'm involved in a couple of other things on that, but the whole idea around how do we address the inequities, the inequalities, and those things, a lot of it's access, right? How do we get access to different things? So sometimes we talk about food insecurity or we talk about financial inequalities, but a lot of it's access to education, access to that. How do you see access changing to address some of that imbalance that you identified in the financial world?
Yeah, well, one of the cool things about advancing technologies is that it has a very democratizing effect. So, if I were to tell you 20 years ago, oh my God, YouTube, it's going to destabilize television advertising and it's going to change, the way that we communicate and it's going to change what getting a message out means, blah, blah, blah. You would have looked at me and if there was any notion and said, Rita, cat videos, come on, seriously? And yet, of course, today, two guys figuratively in a garage can make a video that goes viral enough and attracts enough attention, they can actually make a living on that. So a lot of these new technologies have made it very cheap and very easy to democratize access. Now, what they don't do, unfortunately, is any kind of quality control. So there's Michelangelo out there, and there's your finger painting daughter out there. So I think there will arise the role of trusted curators and people that are making sense out of what really is good here, out of all this stuff. But like any other process, it will attract that kind of attention. So I think it will improve access. I think also things are getting easier. So if I take something like telemedicine, the whole healthcare industry has been very reluctant to embrace that. There's this theory that, it has to be in person and it has to be this and that and the other. But if you think about it, right, so I've got a follow-up visit, right? 90% of what the doctor needs to know can be answered over a Zoom call, right? And you could probably ask a couple of questions which would indicate whether an in-person visit is necessary. But from a patient point of view, I have to sit in the waiting room. And in COVID days, I've got to be with other people. They're never on time, right? So I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs, and then somebody comes and calls your name, and you have to drop everything you were doing and leap up and go through stages and wait. And it's just like, really. And so just take healthcare. What a lot of the new technologies are doing now is bringing healthcare closer to you so that you don't have to go to it. It can come to you. And there are all kinds of advances in monitors and probes and things you can actually learn to do for yourself that you used to have to go to a doctor's office to do. Now, take the second order consequence of something like that. So I'm a pharmaceutical firm and I want to sell a new drug. Well, my previous business model, which is pretty girls in short skirts calling on doctors, how do I do that? The doctor doesn't want to pick up my call in a telemedicine situation. So now you've got a different way that you have to actually approach the market.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the pandemic has really been helpful in the sense of, breaking that first level of resistance, right, to telehealth and also to remote delivery in education. So changing subjects a little bit. So Michael said, both him and I are on the advisory board at the Technological Leadership Institute at the University of Minnesota. And you obviously are in the academia world. And, one of the areas that's being completely turned upside down is higher education. So tell us about your thoughts about where we are with higher education, the impact of the pandemic, and where you think we are going.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that has been made very clear in the pandemic is that the job, if you will, that students hired universities to do are not necessarily the education job, right? So they kind of assume, I'm talking about the classic 4-year in-college experience, right? I mean, they kind of assume the education part's going to be okay. What they really want from that on-campus experience is the coming of age. What club am I going to belong to? Whose heart is going to get broken? Who's am I going to gossip with? Who am I talking about philosophy at 2 a.m? And without that, I think you're going to see a huge resistance to paying, and so the university's in a pickle because their costs don't go down. I mean, they've still got to keep the lights on and keep the buildings going, and yet the customer willingness to pay has gone way down. So that's like the first line of pressure, and you're seeing that already. And so the weaker schools, the ones that were struggling already before, I think are going to not do very well. You're going to see mergers. You're going to see some of them close, absolutely. And what's going to rise in their place, I think, are some really interesting new models. And I'll name a few. So Arizona State, I think, is just been amazing in terms of twisting their model to really work from the student back. So, being there genuinely to serve the student, unlike a lot of universities who frankly are there to serve the faculty, which has always struck me as kind of unfair. Then you've got Southern New Hampshire University, which has separated out that coming of age experience from their I need to get a credential kind of people. And that a lot of that's delivered remotely. So they're up to something like 135,000 enrolled students. And they've paid incredible detailed attention to what those students need to succeed. So for example, you get on the phone with them and they'll say, okay, what other schools did you go to? Sign an electronic permission that we can act on your behalf. We will go get your transcript. We will tell you how many credit hours we can give you. We will tell you what your degree is going to cost, and we'll tell you how long it's going to take you. And as Paul LeBlanc, who's their president, said to me, he said, by the time other schools have done the second callback, we've already got them matriculated. That's really laser in thinking about the customer. The last one that I think is really doing some fascinating things is Hult International Business School. And Johan Roos, who's their dean, basically said, well, what should a truly relevant business school be doing? And he started with job ads. He said, if I start with what employers are looking for and work backward into what kind of curriculum I need to design, that's going to give me really good guidance. And then what they've done at Hult is, so they've got a set of capabilities that they know that are in demand, and then they can actually rate their students on how skilled they are at those capabilities on an objective scale. And I think that kind of thinking is just remarkable. And then it's probably one more step to seeing the partnerships we're already seeing between large corporations and institutions. So, why wouldn't MIT partner with Google? Why wouldn't Minnesota partner with 3M? Why wouldn't we start to see this kind of blend of almost apprenticeship style learning together with what the employers are going to need? And I think that's a really positive development.
I think that's going to have to really be part of the continuous lifelong learning path. The certification process is going to have to become enhanced to tie into the accrediting process. And, for those companies to work that way and for people to be able to stay ahead of, so it's like, well, in an exponential era, our point is in 3 to 5 years, you have a whole new world. In 3 to 5 years, are you able to change your curriculum? Are you able to change your certification programs? Or you're not going to do that without that partnership that you talked about. It just won't happen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very interesting one. There's also the other side of the exponential era, which is we have a tendency to do things and accept and adopt technologies before we really understand what they're going to do. How do you see us going forward on that? One idea we've had is to do additional modeling, on your decision-making process. There's a number of ways to do that, complex interactive networks, things like that. But how do you see that going forward? Because we sort of jump on the shiny object and go, oh gosh, it was sharp.
Right. So I think there are a couple of things you can do. So one thing is to, as you've suggested, do more modeling. I think the thing though is what you want to do is come at it from different points of view. So telling counterfactual stories, I think, is another interesting mental trick. I do think it's valuable to get diverse inputs. And I mean, people coming at it from different disciplines, get an artist or two in the mix, get a poet, get people who think about these things, get a science fiction writer, as William Gibson very famously said, the future, it's already here. It just isn't evenly distributed yet. So where do you go to sort of visit the future that's not the day-to-day yet? A great story about that. My dad, when I was growing up, worked at Xerox, and he was one of the very first people to go out to Xerox Park and see what was going on. And he came back home and he was talking about computer mice and, graphical user interfaces. And we all thought he was out of his mind, but he'd actually been to the future and came back and was able to tell us about it.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little like being, in Plato's allegory of the cave, right? Which is why I really appreciated your book. A lot of us have spent years looking around the corner and it's not always appreciated. And it's a very tough sell sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, take this pandemic as a case in point, right? There were a lot of very influential people who said it's a matter of time. We're going to have a pandemic. We better prepare. And then a lot of other equally influential people who said, don't be ridiculous. And if we had prepared and this thing had not gotten to be the global catastrophe that it is, those same people would have been saying, see, we told you it wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
So you're not always rewarded for seeing around the corners.
We're coming to the end of our time together here, but before we leave, I'd like to bring up another topic that I think is very relevant, very important, and that is the issue of culture. So, Peter Drucker insightfully said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And, one of the great examples of cultural shift that we've seen this decade was the work that Satya Nadella did at Microsoft. And you've talked extensively about that, and we've referred that in our book as well. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts regarding why Satya was so successful in turning around Microsoft and the culture.
Yeah, I think the key to his success was doing what Safi Bahcall, the author of a book called Moonshots, says is actually even more important than culture. It's how you structure things. And what Nadella did was he changed the compensation package for his senior people. And he said, look, if we're going to be a cloud-based, cloud-centered software as a service business, which is where I want us to go, things like customer usage matter, right? And so half of their compensation is what they call power metrics, which are forward-looking things, customer usage, customer love, I mean, I'll never forget. I think I read about this in the book. I was at a Microsoft conference, one of the first big leadership meetings he had, and I was one of the keynote speakers. And I arrived in Bellevue, Washington. I rushed into the ballroom where this thing is being held. And in the back of the room on the projector is the word empathy, like in letters as tall as I am. And I was like, oh, damn, I must be in the wrong conference. I couldn't believe it.
Who would ever say that?
Such a sharp break with what Microsoft historically had been.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? How he was able to turn a culture that seemed to be very adversarial. It's all about showing that you're smart into a company that really understands the importance of not just empathy, but looking at collaboration and focus on the customer and all of those things that we know are essential for success.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So,
one of the axioms that we have is. One of the axioms we have is that performance is the residual of behaviors, right? And it's really about how do you structure compensation, how do you structure the architecture of the company to get the behaviors that you want, and then of course leadership at the top sets the culture. So that had to be just a whole lot of fun, though, to see that dramatic of a shift. That takes a lot of governance guts.
It does. And I think, it's an interesting thing that people haven't talked about as much. But, Nadella is a Microsoft lifer. I mean, he started there pretty early in his career, and he's been there, 28 years or so by now. So I think inside the company, he had that credibility. And I think we don't talk about that enough. We always think of white knights charging in from outside, but sometimes the biggest changes are overseen by people with the longest tenures.
Cut them and they bleed Microsoft, right?
So, Rita, what final message would you like to leave for our audience, especially those that are watching us today and are concerned about, all these fast changes that are happening, and, how do they prepare for this uncertain future that we're dealing with today?
Well, I think one optimistic message I would leave you with is we're all now in a world of high assumptions relative to knowledge that we have. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that the tools of innovation, and you guys will be absolutely familiar with this, the tools of innovation, which consist of exchanging assumptions for knowledge, are incredibly practical and useful here. So there's an entire body of understanding that we can use, which comes from the world of innovation, that we can now apply in our everyday lives.
Very good. Rita, thank you so much for your time today. It was a delightful conversation, a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm looking forward to digging into your book. I've only just received it, so I'm gonna see what I can do.
We're looking forward to getting your thoughts on that as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.